Navy captain mocked the old veteran about still being needed. His reply shut the whole helipad. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The sun was scorching down on the helipad, the air thick with the hum of engines and the smell of jet fuel. Navy Captain Jake Michaels stood near the edge of the helipad, his uniform crisp and his stance full of youthful arrogance. His eyes scanned the area, catching sight of the old man sitting quietly near a corner, his frail body a stark contrast to the modern military equipment surrounding him. The captain snorted and muttered under his breath, "Who's this old guy? Should be at home, not here, trying to relive his glory days." His voice was sharp, dripping with condescension. The old veteran, wearing a worn-out jacket, sat there with a calm demeanor, his eyes gazing into the distance, seemingly lost in thought. He hadn't flinched at the captain's remark. Jake Michaels couldn't stand the silence and the old man's unwavering calm. He sauntered over, his polished boots clicking against the concrete, the young officers around him barely stifling their laughter. "Hey, old man, what are you still doing here? Don't you know this isn't a place for your kind?" He mocked, crossing his arms over his chest. The veteran didn't move, didn't even acknowledge him at first. He simply sat there, his back straight despite the years of wear and tear. "I'm just here for the same reason you are, son." The old man's voice was low but clear, carrying the weight of experience. Captain Michaels raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? What's that? Looking for a seat on the helicopter? 'Cause, let me tell you, you're not needed here. Not by me. Not by anyone." The other officers chuckled, enjoying the captain's dominance. The old man didn't respond immediately, but his eyes never left the horizon. Then, slowly, he reached up to his chest, pulling a faded medal from beneath his jacket, a small yet unmistakable emblem catching the sunlight. "This medal," the veteran said quietly, "reminds me why I'm here." Captain Michaels sneered, not even bothering to look at the decoration. "A medal? That's your excuse? I've seen people wear these for all sorts of reasons. Maybe you got that from some parade. You don't belong here, old man." The laughter of the young officers continued to echo, but the veteran remained silent. The captain's mocking only grew louder, as he stepped forward and poked the old man on the shoulder. "Well, if you really think you still belong here, what's your rank, huh? Let me hear it." The old man slowly turned his head, and for the first time, the captain saw the depth in his eyes. "Rank," he said, his voice steady. "It doesn't matter anymore. I was just a man who did what was needed, when it was needed." There was a brief pause, a moment of silence hanging in the air. Captain Michaels felt a strange shift in the atmosphere. "Old-timer, this isn't the time for your war stories," he said dismissively. But as he turned away, he noticed something odd, an insignia on the veteran's jacket, a symbol that seemed familiar yet foreign. It was then that the air around them seemed to change. A subtle but undeniable presence, like the calm before a storm. The veteran's simple words, spoken with quiet confidence, held a power that began to unsettle the captain. "I'm here because I was needed, and that's all you need to know," the old man continued, his tone now carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. Suddenly, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the tension, the unmistakable rumble of a convoy pulling up, its purpose clear. Captain Michaels froze. His jaw tightened as a black SUV came into view, the vehicle screeching to a halt with military precision. The doors swung open, and out stepped men in impeccable military uniforms, their presence demanding immediate respect. In the lead, the unmistakable figure of General James Hargrove emerged, his four-star insignia gleaming in the sunlight. The captain's heart skipped a beat as the general made his way toward the veteran. Without a word, the general stopped directly in front of him, his eyes locking onto the old man. The surrounding officers stood at attention. General Hargrove raised his hand to his brow, executing a perfect salute. The entire helipad fell into an eerie silence. "Sergeant Major, it's an honor to see you again," the general said, his voice rich with reverence and respect. Captain Michaels' eyes widened in shock. He turned to the other officers, but no one moved. His mind raced as the reality of the moment hit him like a ton of bricks. This was no ordinary veteran. The old man he had mocked, the man he had thought was a relic, was a living legend. His chest tightened as the general's words echoed through the air. This is Sergeant Major Robert Carter, one of the finest men this country has ever known. And yes, Sergeant Major, you are still needed here. You always will be. The silence was deafening as Captain Michaels, along with everyone else, snapped to attention, completely dumbfounded by the turn of events. The silence that followed General Hargrove's salute was thick, almost suffocating. Captain Jake Michaels stood frozen, his mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. The realization hit him like a freight train. The old man he had mocked, the one he thought was just another relic, was someone he would never be able to ignore again. His eyes flicked to the general, still standing tall in front of the veteran, his expression one of profound respect. Sergeant Major Robert Carter. The general's voice rang out, clear and commanding. You've earned more respect than anyone in this entire unit. The words hung in the air like a powerful gust of wind. Every officer, every soldier, felt the weight of them. No one dared move. The moment stretched out, pulling everyone into the gravity of the general's words. The veterans around the helipad stood in awe, their gazes fixed on the old man, who had, until moments ago, been nothing more than a quiet presence in the corner. The realization spread quickly through the ranks. The stories, the legends that only whispered of Sergeant Major Robert Carter, were now no longer just stories. He was here, in the flesh, and he had earned every ounce of respect that was about to be given to him. This is the man who led my unit in the most harrowing battles of our careers, General Hargrove continued, his voice thick with emotion. This man saved countless lives when everyone else thought there was no hope. I wouldn't be standing here today if it weren't for him. Captain Michaels felt his chest tighten. He had spent the last few moments thinking he was in control of the situation, mocking a man who, to him, seemed out of place. Now, standing before him was a man whose reputation preceded him, a man who had lived through battles Michaels could only read about in history books. I know you've heard the stories, General Hargrove said, addressing the rest of the officers who had gathered around, their faces now marked with disbelief and awe. But you will never truly understand what this man has done for this country until you serve beside him. He may not wear the same uniform as you, but his legacy runs deeper than any rank you could achieve. The general stepped aside, giving Sergeant Major Carter room to stand. With a quiet grace, the veteran stood, his back straight despite the years of hardship. His eyes met Captain Michaels, not with anger or contempt, but with a calmness that somehow conveyed more power than any military salute ever could. You mock what you don't understand, son, Sergeant Major Carter said softly, his voice carrying the weight of his years. But that's all right. You'll learn in time. The words, though calm, hit Captain Michaels like a wave crashing against a rocky shore. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words coming out. He could feel the eyes of every officer on him, the silent judgment of his earlier actions now weighing heavily on his shoulders. Captain Michaels, General Hargrove said, his tone now icy. You've just learned a lesson that will stay with you for the rest of your career. Never underestimate the value of experience, and never forget the men and women who paved the way before you. Michaels could feel the heat rising in his face as the general's words sank in. He had spent so much of his life focused on his own ambitions, his own goals, that he had failed to see the true depth of the veterans who stood before him. It was humbling, in a way that cut through every ounce of pride he had ever known. The veteran's legacy was not defined by medals or titles, but by the countless lives he had saved, the battles he had fought, and the respect he had earned. From every soldier who knew him. As the general motioned for Sergeant Major Carter to lead the way, the crowd parted, allowing the two men to pass. Michaels, still stunned, watched as the old man walked by him, the weight of history in every step. He couldn't bring himself to look away, feeling the sting of his own ignorance. What's your rank, Captain? The question came from Sergeant Major Carter, breaking Michaels from his trance. He looked up, his throat dry. Sir? He asked, unsure if he had heard right. Your rank, Carter repeated, his voice steady. I know you must have one, but it doesn't matter here. Not in the presence of a true leader. Captain Michaels swallowed hard, his mind scrambling for the words. He had nothing left to say. As the general and the veteran walked toward the helicopter, the officers stood at attention, their faces unreadable. In that moment, Captain Michaels understood. The old man had just taught him the most important lesson of his career, one that would shape every action he took from that day forward. As the hum of the helicopter engines grew louder, Captain Jake Michaels stood there, still rooted to the spot, processing the events that had unfolded. General Hargrove and Sergeant Major Carter were already heading toward the helicopter, their strides purposeful, the atmosphere around them heavy with the weight of recognition. Michaels couldn't move, couldn't speak. His thoughts were in turmoil, a maelstrom of confusion, shame, and newfound respect. He had always prided himself on his sharpness, his quick wit, and his ambition to rise through the ranks. But standing in the presence of Sergeant Major Carter, he realized just how hollow those things seemed now. He had spent so much of his career focused on his own achievements, his own path to glory, that he had completely missed the bigger picture, the quiet strength of those who had already earned their place in history. The sound of footsteps behind him snapped Michaels out of his reverie. He turned to find one of his fellow officers, Lieutenant Sarah Davis, walking toward him. She was younger than him, but there was something in her eyes that made Michaels pause. She was looking at him with a mix of pity and understanding. "You all right, Captain?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Michaels swallowed hard, trying to gather himself. "I don't know what just happened, Davis," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I had it all figured out. I thought I was doing my job, following the rules, but now I don't even know what to think." Lieutenant Davis nodded slowly, her expression softening. "It's a hard lesson, sir," she said quietly. "But it's one you needed to learn. We all needed to learn it." Michaels looked back toward the helicopter, where General Hargrove and Sergeant Major Carter were now boarding. The veteran's presence, so calm and assured, seemed to command the entire space, leaving no room for doubt or hesitation. "I've spent years believing that rank and medals define you," Michaels said, more to himself than to Davis. "But that man, he has no need for any of that. He's earned more respect than I'll ever have." Lieutenant Davis didn't respond right away. She just stood there, watching him as the weight of his words seemed to settle on both of them. The silence stretched for a moment before she spoke again. "Respect isn't about the medals you wear or the rank on your collar," she said softly. "It's about what you've done, what you've sacrificed. Sergeant Major Carter has lived through things most of us can't even begin to imagine, and he never asked for recognition. He just did what needed to be done." Michaels closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He could feel the sting of his earlier arrogance, the sharp reminder of how little he truly knew. "I've made a fool of myself," he admitted, his voice tinged with shame. "I mocked a man who has seen more in a day than I ever will in my whole career." Lieutenant Davis placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a rare moment of comfort. "It happens, sir. We all get caught up in our own egos sometimes. But you'll be better for this. You'll be a better leader because of it." Michaels nodded, but the sting of his mistake lingered. As the helicopter's engines roared to life, the rest of the officers gathered around, their faces still a mixture of awe and confusion. The reality of what had just transpired was starting to settle in. No one dared speak, not even a whisper. General Hargrove's voice cut through the silence, commanding the attention of everyone around. "Get ready for the debrief," he ordered, his tone firm but measured. "Sergeant Major Carter will be speaking with us soon." With that, the officers quickly gathered their equipment, preparing for the next stage of the mission. But Michaels couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside him. He had spent years climbing the military ladder, thinking that each step brought him closer to understanding what it meant to be a leader. But now, standing in the shadow of Sergeant Major Carter, he realized that true leadership wasn't about titles or power. It was about humility, sacrifice, and the quiet strength that comes from living through the hardest battles and never asking for anything in return. As the team boarded the helicopter, Michaels felt a newfound sense of resolve. He wasn't the same man who had walked onto this helipad that morning. He had been humbled, and in that humility, he found something far more valuable than any rank or medal, the understanding of what it truly meant to serve. And as the helicopter took off, soaring into the skies above, Captain Jake Michaels made a silent promise to himself. He would never forget the lesson he had learned today. He would never again underestimate the value of a man like Sergeant Major Robert Carter. As the helicopter ascended into the bright sky, Captain Jake Michaels sat in silence, still grappling with the weight of the morning's events. The hum of the engines was a far cry from the chaotic thoughts swirling in his head. His eyes stared out the window, but his mind was somewhere else, somewhere deeper. He had spent his life chasing recognition, striving to climb higher in the ranks, believing that each step would bring him closer to the respect he thought he deserved. But now, in the presence of Sergeant Major Robert Carter, he realized how misplaced those ambitions had been. The veteran had never sought recognition, never craved the spotlight. Yet here he was, respected by men and women who had spent their careers fighting in wars he could only read about. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden voice of General Hargrove, cutting through the silence. "Captain Michaels," the general's voice was calm but firm. "I know you've been processing what just happened, but there's something important you need to understand." Jake turned toward the general, who was sitting across from him, his eyes steady. "Unwavering." "Yes, sir?" he asked, his voice a little quieter than usual. "You've learned a valuable lesson today," General Hargrove continued. "Respect is not something that can be demanded. It's earned." And Sergeant Major Carter, despite the fact that he spent most of his life out of the spotlight, is the epitome of that earned respect. Jake nodded, trying to absorb the weight of the general's words. "I understand, sir," he said, his voice thick with realization. General Hargrove's gaze softened, but his tone remained serious. "You will never be the leader you aspire to be unless you learn that lesson fully. This isn't about medals or titles. It's about what you've done, the people you've helped, and the way you carry yourself under pressure." Jake sat back in his seat, looking down at his hands. He could feel the weight of his own previous arrogance, the embarrassment of how he had treated Sergeant Major Carter. But more than that, he felt something else stirring within him, a quiet resolve. He wasn't the same man who had walked onto the helipad just hours ago. He had seen the truth of what it meant to be a true leader, and he was determined to embrace it. As the helicopter flew on, the team began to settle into the rhythm of the mission. Yet Jake couldn't shake the thought of Sergeant Major Carter. The veteran's presence was now a permanent fixture in his mind, a reminder of what true strength and humility looked like. The quiet dignity of the man who had never asked for recognition, never cared for accolades, but who had earned respect through years of service, sacrifice, and silent leadership. "General, may I ask something?" Jake spoke up again, his voice steadier now. General Hargrove turned toward him, his expression giving Jake the sense that he was ready to listen. "What happens now?" Jake asked. "Now that we know who Sergeant Major Carter really is?" The general's lips curled into a faint smile. "Now," he said slowly, "we follow his example. We learn from him, and we make sure that the men and women who serve with us never forget the kind of people they should strive to be." Jake nodded, a new sense of purpose filling him. He didn't know how he would go about changing, but he knew that he would. He had seen a different kind of leadership in Sergeant Major Carter, a leadership forged in the heat of battle, not in the halls of power or the polished floors of military institutions. It was a leadership that didn't need to prove itself. It simply was. As the helicopter made its way toward their destination, Jake Michaels felt a sense of clarity he had never experienced before. He knew that from this moment forward, his path would be different. He would no longer chase titles or accolades. He would focus on what truly mattered, earning the respect of those who served with him, and doing whatever it took to be a leader like Sergeant Major Carter. The helicopter descended slowly, and as it neared the landing site, Jake looked out the window one last time. He wasn't just seeing the world below him anymore. He was seeing his own future, a future shaped by a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the mission progressed, the weight of the day's lesson stayed with Captain Jake Michaels. The helicopter touched down softly on the designated landing zone, and the team began to disembark, their movements swift and purposeful. But for Jake, every step felt slower than usual. His mind was consumed with the image of Sergeant Major Robert Carter, his quiet dignity, and the powerful lesson that had been delivered to him without a single word of condemnation. It wasn't just about rank or medals. It was about the integrity of one's actions and the silent strength that came with a life well lived. Jake followed the rest of the team, but his steps felt heavier. He had never been one to dwell on mistakes, but this one felt different. He had mocked a man who had earned more in one day than Jake could ever hope to achieve. And now, standing here, With the hum of the mission in full swing, he could only think of how he would never be the same. The mission, despite its importance, felt almost secondary to the realization that had dawned on him. The team moved into position, setting up the perimeter and preparing for the task ahead. Jake, though, wasn't fully present. His mind was still with Sergeant Major Carter. As they settled into position, General Hargrove approached him. The general's expression was unreadable, but Jake could sense that something had shifted between them. "Captain," the general began, his voice steady. "I know you've been thinking a lot about this morning, and I want to make sure you understand the full impact of what happened." Jake turned to face the general, his posture a bit stiffer than usual. "Yes, sir," he responded, his voice carrying the weight of his thoughts. "I've learned a lot today, more than I ever thought possible." General Hargrove nodded, a slight shift in his demeanor that indicated he understood. "It's not just about recognizing your mistakes," he said quietly. "It's about what you do with that recognition, how you grow from it. You've seen what true leadership looks like today. Now, it's your turn to embody it." The words hit Jake hard. He had seen true leadership, yes, but he had also seen how easy it was to slip into arrogance when one was too focused on themselves. He had been blind to what really mattered: the lives touched, the respect earned, the quiet warriors who carried the weight of service without needing to be in the spotlight. "I understand, sir," Jake replied, his voice steady now. "I'm going to do better. I promise." The general's expression softened, just a little. "You will, Captain, and I'll be here to help guide you when you need it. But remember, it's not just about being a good soldier. It's about being a good leader." With that, General Hargrove gave Jake a small nod and walked away, leaving Jake to reflect on the words that had settled deep in his chest. As Jake stood there, the sounds of the mission around him seemed to fade into the background. He was still processing the enormity of what had happened. He had always thought of leadership as something you earned by following orders, by climbing the ladder, by making quick decisions in high-pressure situations. But now, he realized it was about more than that. Leadership was about the respect you earned through your actions, the way you carried yourself, and the way you treated others, no matter their rank or position. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity, but Jake remained focused. He moved with purpose, his mind working through what he had learned and how he could apply it. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest things he had ever done, acknowledging his shortcomings and facing the reality of his own arrogance. But with every step, he felt a shift within himself. By the time they wrapped up the mission and returned to base, Jake knew he wasn't the same man who had boarded that helicopter earlier in the day. He had a new understanding of leadership, one that wasn't about titles or achievements. It was about humility, service, and earning the trust and respect of those around you, regardless of their rank or history. As they all gathered around for the debriefing, Jake stood a little taller, his posture more aligned with the lessons he had learned. The team members filed in, and as they sat, General Hargrove's voice filled the room. "Great work today, everyone. We accomplished our mission, but remember, what we do here is bigger than just the task at hand. It's about who we are as a unit, as a team, and as leaders." Jake took a deep breath, ready to embrace the next challenge, ready to lead in a way that honored the lessons he had learned. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt prepared to walk it with the quiet confidence that came with true leadership. The next few days passed in a blur for Captain Jake Michaels. The mission had been a success, but the real battle was taking place inside him. Every step he took, every order he gave, seemed to carry the weight of the lesson he had learned on that helipad. He could still see the calm determination in Sergeant Major Robert Carter's eyes, hear General Hargrove's words ringing in his mind. Leadership, true leadership, was not something that could be learned in a book or earned through ambition alone. It was earned through respect, humility, and the quiet strength of knowing when to step forward and when to step back. Jake was still grappling with the shift inside himself when General Hargrove called him into his office. The office was quiet, the walls lined with various commendations and photos of past missions. Hargrove stood by the window, looking out over the base with a thoughtful expression. When Jake entered, the general turned to face him, his demeanor calm but firm. "Captain Michaels," General Hargrove began, "I've been watching you these past few days. I can see the shift in you, the growth. But there's still more to be done." Jake stood tall, ready to listen. He had learned more from the general in the past few days than he had in his entire career. "What do you need me to do, sir?" he asked. The general's gaze was steady. "You've learned the most important lesson, that leadership is about respect. But now, you need to put that into practice. You need to lead your team, not with just orders, but with understanding. Show them what you've learned." Jake nodded, absorbing every word. This wasn't just about leading in battle or on missions. It was about leading by example, by showing his men the kind of leader he now aspired to be. "I'll do it, sir," Jake said, his voice firm with resolve. "I won't let you down." The general gave a small nod, satisfied with the response. "I know you won't, Captain. But remember, leadership isn't about being liked. It's about earning trust. And sometimes, that means making hard decisions." With that, General Hargrove dismissed Jake, who left the office with a renewed sense of purpose. The next day, the opportunity to put his newfound leadership into practice came sooner than expected. The team was preparing for another mission, and Jake could feel the tension in the air. The men were focused, but there was something off, something subtle that he couldn't quite put his finger on. As they gathered in the briefing room, Jake noticed one of the younger officers, Lieutenant Jameson, looking a bit distracted, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Jake made his way over to him, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Jameson, you all right?" he asked, his tone quiet but firm. The lieutenant looked up, startled. "Yeah, sir," Jameson replied, his voice a bit shaky. "Just nervous about the mission. It's a tough one, you know." Jake nodded. He understood. The pressure of being in the field, of having lives in your hands, was something that never fully went away. But this was where his leadership would be tested. "It's normal to feel nervous," Jake said, his voice calm and reassuring. "But remember, we've trained for this. We've done the hard work. You're ready. We're ready." Jameson gave a small nod, the tension in his posture easing just slightly. "Thanks, sir. I needed to hear that." Jake smiled. "Anytime, Lieutenant. You've got this." As the mission briefing began, Jake stood at the front of the room, his mind focused on what he needed to do. He wasn't just going to lead his men with orders. He was going to lead by showing them that he believed in them, that he trusted them to get the job done. The mission went smoothly, but Jake's leadership was tested in ways he hadn't expected. When things went wrong, as they inevitably did in the field, he had to make quick decisions. But this time, he didn't act from a place of ego or pride. He didn't bark orders from the front. He listened to his team, took in their concerns, and made decisions with their input. By the end of the day, the mission was completed successfully, and Jake could feel the difference in the way his team viewed him. It wasn't just about the success of the mission. It was about the way they worked together, the trust that had been built through shared decisions and mutual respect. As the team sat around the debrief table, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not in the mission's success, but in the way he had led his men. They weren't just following orders, they were following him. And for the first time in his career, Jake Michaels understood what it meant to be a leader. It wasn't about commanding respect through rank or title. It was about earning it through actions, through the way you treated people, through the way you stood by them in the toughest of times. The mission was over, but the journey was just beginning for Jake. He knew that he had a long road ahead, filled with challenges and opportunities to grow. But for the first time, he felt ready to walk it. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a leader, and that was a responsibility he would never take lightly. The days following the mission were a turning point for Captain Jake Michaels. He could feel the change in himself, a deeper understanding of what it meant to lead, not just as a soldier, but as someone worthy of the trust his men had placed in him. The hum of military life, the constant rhythm of orders and operations, had begun to feel different. It was no longer just about executing tasks efficiently. It was about creating an environment where every team member felt heard, respected, and valued. He spent the next few days observing his team more closely, seeing their strengths, their weaknesses, and the subtle ways they communicated with each other. The shift in his leadership was not always immediately visible, but it was there, under the surface. Every decision he made, every action he took, was now guided by a sense of humility and responsibility. His soldiers began to notice the difference. Lieutenant Jameson, who had been struggling with the pressures of the mission, approached him one morning, a hesitant look on his face. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you," Jameson began, his voice unsure. "For what?" Jake asked, genuinely puzzled. "For believing in me," Jameson continued, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I was nervous about the mission, about not being good enough. But you gave me the confidence I needed to get through it. I know I wouldn't have made it without your support. Jake was silent for a moment, taken aback by the honesty in Jameson's voice. He had never thought about leadership in that way before. It wasn't just about making decisions or issuing commands. It was about providing his team with the confidence to succeed, to know that they were capable. You did the hard work, Jameson, Jake finally replied. I just made sure you knew I believed in you. The young officer smiled, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. Thank you, sir. The encounter left Jake with a sense of pride, but it also made him realize that leadership was a daily practice. It wasn't a one-time lesson learned on a helipad or a singular moment of clarity. It was about how he showed up each day, how he interacted with his team, how he made decisions that kept their well-being and success in mind. The weeks that followed were a test of that practice. Jake faced new challenges, both personal and professional, that pushed him to maintain his resolve and put his leadership skills into action. There were difficult conversations with higher-ups, moments of doubt from his team, and situations where he had to make tough calls. But each time, he remembered the lessons he had learned from Sergeant Major Carter. The quiet strength, the humility, the power of listening, and the importance of respecting those around him. One of the hardest tests came when the unit was called to respond to a crisis, a high-stakes mission that required swift action. The pressure was immense, and Jake could feel the tension rising as they prepared for the operation. This mission wasn't just about executing the task at hand. It was about his leadership in the face of uncertainty. As they geared up for the operation, Jake gathered his team in the briefing room. He could feel the nervous energy in the room, the uncertainty in their eyes. He took a deep breath, standing tall before them. I know this mission is going to be tough, he said, his voice calm but firm. But we've trained for this. We've been through worse. We are ready, and I trust every single one of you. The room fell into a heavy silence, but the tension was different now. It wasn't the oppressive weight of doubt, but the solid presence of trust. Jake could see it in their eyes. They believed in him, just as he believed in them. As the mission unfolded, Jake moved with a new sense of purpose. His decisions were swift, his actions decisive, but always with a deep awareness of the impact they would have on his team. He wasn't just issuing orders. He was guiding them, leading them through the uncertainty with the same calm resolve that Sergeant Major Carter had shown him. The mission was a success, but it was the way the team came together that marked the true victory. They had worked as a unit, not just because they had to, but because they trusted each other, because they respected each other. It was a victory that couldn't be measured in objectives alone. As they debriefed afterward, Jake sat back and listened as his men shared their thoughts. There was a sense of camaraderie, of mutual respect, that hadn't been there before. It was a quiet confidence, a shared understanding that they had accomplished something important. Not just the mission, but the way they had worked together. General Hargrove, who had been overseeing the operation from a distance, approached Jake as the team finished up. Well done, Captain, the general said, his voice carrying the weight of approval. You led them well. Jake felt a rush of pride, but it was tempered by something deeper, gratitude. He knew he hadn't done it alone. He had been guided by the lessons of a man who had lived through more than Jake could ever imagine. A man who had taught him that leadership wasn't about titles, wasn't about accolades. It was about earning the respect of your team, day by day, moment by moment. Thank you, sir, Jake replied, his voice steady. I couldn't have done it without the team. We did this together. As the team gathered their gear and prepared to leave the debriefing room, Jake felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about the mission. It was about who they had become, both as soldiers and as leaders. Jake Michaels had learned that the true measure of leadership wasn't in how high you climbed, but in how you lifted those around you. And with that knowledge, he knew he was ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed continued to challenge Captain Jake Michaels in ways he never expected. The lessons learned from Sergeant Major Robert Carter, General Hargrove, and the mission itself were still fresh in his mind. Jake had become more thoughtful in his decisions, more aware of his role as a leader. He was no longer just a man focused on getting things done. He was now a man focused on getting things done the right way, with respect and humility guiding every step. But, as with all transitions, the road was not without its bumps. There were moments of doubt, moments when the old instincts to lead with authority resurfaced. It was on one of these days, in the middle of an intense training exercise with his team, that Jake felt the true test of his leadership. The sun beat down on the training ground as the team moved through a series of drills designed to push them to their limits. The exercises were grueling, requiring a combination of physical endurance, quick thinking, and coordination. Jake watched as his team navigated the obstacles, some struggling more than others. Lieutenant Jameson, who had grown more confident in the months since the mission, was having a tough time with one of the drills. His movements were a bit off, his timing slightly delayed. Jake could see the frustration in Jameson's eyes as he struggled to keep up with the rest of the team. In the past, Jake might have pushed Jameson harder, maybe even reprimanded him for falling behind. But today, something had changed. Today, Jake didn't want to be that kind of leader. He walked over to Jameson, who was breathing heavily, his face a mix of exhaustion and self-doubt. "You good, Lieutenant?" Jake asked, his tone calm and understanding. Jameson looked up, his frustration evident. "I can't keep up, sir. I'm falling behind the others." Jake smiled gently, a rarity for him, but something he had learned to embrace. "Jameson, you've come a long way. You're pushing yourself, and that's all I can ask for. Don't worry about keeping up with anyone else right now. Just focus on what you need to do." Jameson paused, taking in the words. "Thanks, sir," he said quietly, the tension in his posture slowly easing. Jake gave him a pat on the back. "We're all in this together. Don't forget that." As Jake walked away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the way he handled the situation. He had made a conscious decision to lead differently. Where once he might have demanded more from his team, now he knew that sometimes the best thing a leader could do was offer support and encouragement. The rest of the training session went smoothly. Jameson picked up his pace, pushing through the fatigue, and by the end of the day, he had successfully completed the course. As the team gathered for the debrief, Jake felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about completing the drill perfectly. It was about how they had worked together, how they had supported one another through the challenges. The team was growing, not just in their physical abilities, but in their trust in one another. Later that evening, as Jake sat in his office, reviewing the mission reports, he received a message from General Hargrove. It was brief, but to the point. "I'm proud of how you've been handling things. Keep it up." Jake smiled to himself. The words of affirmation from the general meant more to him than he had expected. It wasn't the praise that mattered. It was the acknowledgement that he was on the right path. The journey of leadership, Jake realized, wasn't a destination. It was a continuous process of learning, growing, and adapting. The next challenge came sooner than expected. The team was called to respond to a situation overseas, a mission that would test them in ways they hadn't anticipated. As they prepared for deployment, Jake could feel the weight of the responsibility settle in his chest. This was going to be a tough one. But as he looked around at his team, he felt a sense of confidence he hadn't had before. They were ready. They were not just a group of soldiers. They were a team, and they trusted each other. Jake knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And he would be there, leading them with the same calm resolve that had guided him through the past months. The next morning, as the plane touched down on the foreign soil, Jake stood at the front of the group, looking out at the landscape ahead. The mission ahead was uncertain, and the risks were high, but for the first time, he felt ready. He was not just the man who gave orders anymore. He was the leader who earned his team's trust, who led by example, who understood the value of humility, respect, and service. And that, Jake knew, was the true measure of leadership. The weeks that followed were filled with constant motion. The mission Jake Michaels and his team had completed was just the beginning of what was shaping up to be a long stretch of deployments and training exercises. As the days passed, Jake felt the weight of responsibility heavier on his shoulders. The lessons from Sergeant Major Robert Carter, General Hargrove, and even the struggles with his own leadership were still fresh in his mind. Jake had made a promise to himself that he would be the kind of leader who inspired trust, who led with humility and strength. But every new challenge brought new pressure. The first big test after their deployment came when the team was assigned to a high-risk mission in a volatile region overseas. This mission would take them deep into unfamiliar territory where the stakes were higher than anything they had encountered before. The briefings were intense. The information they were given about the enemy forces was daunting. Jake could feel the anxiety in his team as they sat through the debriefing, the weight of the situation starting to sink in. He could see the tension in Lieutenant Jameson's jaw, the way the rest of the officers exchanged nervous glances. This was a mission that could change everything. But Jake knew that his leadership, the very core of what he had learned in the past months, was about to be tested in a way it hadn't been before. He stood at the front of the room, the weight of every pair of eyes in the room fixed on him. He had seen what it looked like when a team was uncertain, when they were on edge. He wasn't going to let that happen. "I know this mission is tough," Jake began, his voice steady but firm. "I know the risks are high, but I also know that we are prepared. We've trained for this. We've faced challenges before, and we've come out on top. This isn't going to be easy, but we are a team. And together, we can accomplish anything." The room was quiet for a moment, but Jake could feel the energy in the room shift. He wasn't just talking to them. He was talking with them. He was showing them the kind of leader he had promised to be. Lieutenant Jameson, still looking a little tense, nodded slowly, his shoulders visibly relaxing. The rest of the team seemed to take a collective breath, as if the tension had been lifted, even if just a little. As the team prepared to leave for the mission, Jake knew there was still more he needed to do. The confidence he had given them in the briefing was important, but it wasn't enough. They needed to know that he would be there every step of the way, not just as a leader, but as a teammate. In the days leading up to the mission, Jake spent more time with the team. He didn't just bark orders from the front. He spent time in the trenches with them, working through problems, sharing concerns, and making sure that each member of the team knew they were supported. When they finally touched down in the operation zone, Jake's focus shifted from leadership to action. The mission was as difficult as they had feared. Enemy resistance was heavy, and the terrain was treacherous. But in the thick of it, Jake remained calm, making split-second decisions that kept his team moving forward. When the situation grew increasingly dire, Jake knew that he had to be more than just a commander giving orders. He had to be the person who led from the front, the one who inspired his men with actions, not just words. During a critical point in the mission, when an ambush had pinned down a part of the team, Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gear and moved toward the front lines, positioning himself with the rest of the team to break the enemy's hold. The firefight was intense, the sounds of gunfire echoing in the valley as Jake led the charge, pushing the team forward with each step. The success of the mission, in part, was due to the tactical decisions Jake had made in the heat of the moment, but it was also due to the trust his men had in him. They saw him not as someone who gave orders from a distance, but as someone who was willing to risk everything to ensure their safety and success. By the time the mission was over and the dust had settled, Jake felt the exhaustion in his bones, but he also felt something else. It was the sense of accomplishment that came not from a job well done, but from knowing that his team had trusted him every step of the way. They had followed him not because of his rank or his title, but because they believed in him. As the team gathered around for the debriefing, Jake looked at each of them, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. This wasn't just a victory. It was a confirmation of everything he had worked for. They were no longer just a team of soldiers. They were a unit, a cohesive group that functioned on trust, mutual respect, and a shared understanding of what it meant to serve together. General Hargrove's voice broke through his thoughts as the debriefing began. "Well done, Captain Michaels," the general said, his tone more approving than Jake had ever heard it before. "You've earned the respect of your men, and it shows. Your leadership was solid under pressure." Jake felt a wave of gratitude, but also humility. He knew that the success of the mission wasn't just due to his actions, but to the way the team had come together, the way they had all trusted each other. As the team filed out of the debriefing room, Jake stayed behind for a moment, taking in the weight of what had just happened. He had led them through one of the toughest missions they'd ever faced, and they had come out the other side stronger, more united than before. Jake Michaels wasn't just a leader anymore. He was part of something bigger, a team that valued trust above all else. After the mission, Jake Michaels found himself in a rare moment of quiet reflection. The base was bustling with activity as usual, but he had stepped away from the noise, taking a walk to clear his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that the recent victory had been a turning point, not just for the mission, but for him personally. As the weight of the operation settled in, Jake found himself thinking back to the lessons he had learned, the wisdom shared by Sergeant Major Carter, and the support of his team. He had led them through one of the toughest challenges they'd faced, but it was more than just the physical battle. It had been a test of trust, leadership, and camaraderie. The success of the mission, Jake realized, wasn't just about tactics or strategy. It was about how they had functioned as a team, how they had supported each other through the hardest moments. And that was the leadership Jake had worked so hard to embody. Later that evening, as Jake sat in his office, the door opened, and Lieutenant Jameson stepped inside. "Sir," Jameson began, hesitating for a moment. "Can we talk?" Jake looked up, nodding. "Of course, Lieutenant. What's on your mind?" Jameson looked a little uneasy, but he stepped forward and sat across from Jake. "I've been thinking about everything that happened during the mission. I wanted to thank you. I've never felt so supported before. You didn't just lead us. You made sure we knew that we were in this together." Jake leaned back in his chair, absorbing the words. He could see the gratitude in Jameson's eyes. "I just did my job," Jake replied softly. "But it wasn't just me. We all did our part." Jameson shook his head. "No, sir. You led in a way that made us trust you. You trusted us, and that made all the difference." Jake felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. He had been so focused on the mission, on his leadership, that he hadn't realized how much of an impact his actions had on the team. It wasn't just about the tactical decisions or the success of the operation. It was about showing his team that he cared about them, that their well-being mattered. "Thank you, Lieutenant," Jake said, his voice sincere. "That means more to me than you know." As Jameson left, Jake sat in silence for a moment, thinking about how far he had come. Just a few months ago, he had been focused on proving himself, on making sure his name was remembered. But now, he realized that the legacy he wanted to leave was not about accolades or recognition. It was about the people he led, the men and women who had trusted him. The next day, the team received another assignment. It was a delicate operation, involving coordination with international forces, and the pressure was high. But this time, Jake felt different. He didn't approach it with the usual urgency or impatience. He was calm, steady, and most importantly, he was focused on the team. During the briefing, Jake could sense the tension in the room. This mission was going to be challenging, but he wasn't worried. Not because he had all the answers, but because he trusted his team. He trusted them to step up, to work together, and to handle the pressure. "We've faced worse," Jake said to the group, his voice confident. "This mission is tough, but I know we are ready. And I'm here with you every step of the way." He could see the relief in their eyes as they absorbed his words. They weren't looking for a leader who had all the answers. They were looking for someone they could rely on, someone who would be there with them when things got tough. As the mission unfolded, Jake's leadership was tested once again. There were moments of uncertainty, moments where the plan didn't go as expected. But in every decision, Jake remained calm. He worked alongside his team, adjusting the plan as needed, but always keeping them informed, always keeping them involved. By the time the mission was completed, the team had not only succeeded, but they had done so together, as a unified force. Jake knew that the success of the operation was a direct result of the trust he had built with his team. He hadn't led from the front, barking orders from a distance. He had led from within the team, guiding them, supporting them, and showing them that their success was just as important as his own. That evening, as the team returned to base, Jake felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The mission had been tough, but it had been another step forward in his journey as a leader. It wasn't about the victory itself. It was about how they had faced the challenge together. He had learned what it meant to lead, to be part of something bigger than himself, to trust those around him, and to earn their respect, not through power, but through integrity and humility. As the sun set over the base, Jake looked out across the horizon, feeling the weight of everything he had learned and everything still to come. He wasn't finished yet. This was just the beginning. The following weeks were a turning point for Captain Jake Michaels and his team. They had returned from their last mission, victorious but exhausted. The experience had only deepened Jake's understanding of what true leadership was. He wasn't just leading his team through operations. He was now leading them with a purpose that went beyond simply completing tasks. He was helping them grow, trust each other, and face challenges together. The transition from being a soldier focused solely on mission success to a leader who nurtured his team's development was not an easy one, but it felt right. Jake found himself reflecting often on the lessons learned from Sergeant Major Robert Carter. The strength, humility, and silent leadership that Carter had displayed in the past had become the foundation of Jake's own approach. But as the team prepared for another deployment, Jake felt the pressure mounting again. This mission was different. It wasn't just another high-risk operation. It was personal. Intelligence had suggested that enemy forces were planning an attack on an important Allied base, and the stakes were higher than ever. Jake knew the mission would push his team to their limits. As they gathered in the briefing room, Jake could feel the tension in the air. The mission was risky, but what worried Jake the most was how his team would respond to the pressure. They had faced danger before, but this time, the consequences felt even more significant. "Listen up, everyone," Jake said, his voice steady but carrying authority. "I know this mission is going to test us. It's not just about completing the task. It's about ensuring our allies stay safe. And it's about us doing what's right. We have to stay calm under pressure, trust each other, and support one another. This mission, like all the others, isn't just about me leading you. It's about all of us leading together." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each team member. He saw the respect, the trust they had in him, but he also saw the fear. It was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of fear that every soldier feels before a dangerous mission. But Jake knew they could do this. They had done it before. It wasn't about having the best equipment or the perfect plan. It was about how they worked together under pressure, how they trusted each other. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Training runs, tactical briefings, and countless hours spent reviewing intelligence reports. Jake was right there with his team, not sitting behind a desk or giving orders from a distance. He was with them, running the drills, staying in the trenches, reminding them that this mission was about their collective strength. Finally, the day came when they would leave for the operation. Jake stood in front of his team once more, as the helicopter engines began to roar to life. "This is it," he said, his voice low but firm. "Stay sharp. Stay focused. But most importantly, remember what we stand for. We are a team. We've trained for this. Trust in each other, and we'll get through this together." The team nodded, their faces hardening with resolve. As the helicopter lifted off, Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility, but this time, it didn't feel as heavy. The lessons of the past few months had made him stronger. He knew what kind of leader he needed to be, and he was determined to lead them the right way. The mission unfolded exactly as Jake had feared. Enemy forces were waiting for them. The first few hours were a blur of movement, gunfire, and radio chatter. Jake's team moved quickly and efficiently, but the tension in the air was palpable. They were under fire from all sides, and every decision Jake made had life-or-death consequences. In the chaos of the battlefield, Jake remained calm. He focused on the mission, but he also kept an eye on his team, making sure they were staying together, staying focused, and staying alive. There was a moment during the operation when things looked bleak. One of the team members, Sergeant Davidson, had been pinned down by enemy fire. Jake knew he had to act fast. Without hesitation, he barked out orders to the rest of the team and moved toward Davidson's position. He wasn't thinking about the risk. He wasn't thinking about his own safety. He was thinking about his team, about getting them to safety, about making sure they made it through this together. When Jake reached Davidson, the young soldier was injured but alive. With Jake's help, Davidson was able to make it to cover, and the team was able to regroup. It wasn't the first time Jake had made a dangerous move in the field, but this time, something felt different. He wasn't just leading with orders. He was leading with heart. The mission continued, and eventually, they achieved their objective. The enemy forces were neutralized, and the Allied base was secure. But as Jake stood there, looking at his team, he knew the true victory wasn't in completing the mission. It was in how they had done it, together. The trust, the respect, the shared responsibility. It was all there. As they made their way back to the extraction point, Jake's thoughts wandered once more to Sergeant Major Carter. He knew he still had a long way to go, but he also knew that the lessons Carter had taught him, humility, sacrifice, and leadership, would guide him for the rest of his career. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a leader, and the responsibility that came with it was one he would never take lightly. The success of the mission was still fresh in the minds of Captain Jake Michaels and his team. They had accomplished what they set out to do, but in the aftermath, Jake couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed within himself and the unit. He had faced the hardest tests of his leadership yet, and each time, he had come through stronger, more focused on what really mattered. He wasn't just a leader by rank anymore. He was a leader by the respect and trust he had earned. As the team returned to base, Jake found himself back in familiar surroundings. The base was quiet, the calm after the storm, but the weight of the past few weeks still hung heavily in his thoughts. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about what came next. The world wasn't waiting for him to get it right. But for the first time in his career, Jake knew what it meant to lead, to truly lead, not by orders, but by example. General Hargrove had been watching him closely, offering occasional words of encouragement, but never too much praise. Jake wasn't the kind of man who sought accolades, but he knew that the general's approval meant something. As he sat in his office, reviewing the mission reports, the door opened, and Lieutenant Jameson stepped in. Jake looked up, surprised to see the young officer standing there. "Sir, got a minute?" Jameson asked, his tone a little uncertain. "Of course, Lieutenant. What's on your mind?" Jake motioned for Jameson to take a seat. Jameson sat down, his hands clasped in front of him, looking a little uncomfortable. "I've been thinking a lot about the mission, about everything that's happened lately," Jameson began, his voice quieter than usual. "And I wanted to say, I don't think I could have made it through without your leadership." Jake gave him a nod, though he wasn't quite sure what to say. The words meant a lot, but it felt strange to be on the receiving end of such praise. "I did my job, Jameson," Jake said, keeping his voice steady. "We all did our part." Jameson shook his head, his expression serious. "No, sir. I've been in plenty of tough spots before. But this time, it felt different. You didn't just give orders. You led us. You had our backs, and you made sure we were all in it together." Jake paused, letting the words sink in. It wasn't just about making the right tactical decisions or being in the right place at the right time. It was about trust. It was about showing his team that they weren't alone, that their success was as important as his own. "Thank you, sir," Jameson added, his voice sincere. "I mean it." Jake met his gaze, nodding once more. "It's my job to lead, Lieutenant. But it's not just about me. It's about all of us." Jameson smiled, a look of genuine appreciation crossing his face. "I know, sir. And that's what makes you different." After Jameson left, Jake sat back in his chair, reflecting on the conversation. He had always believed in leading by example, but hearing it from Jameson made him realize just how much his team had come to trust him. That trust was something that couldn't be taken for granted. It was something he had to keep earning every day. The next few weeks were filled with training and preparations for whatever came next. The world wasn't slowing down, and neither was Jake's team. They were constantly on the move, always ready for the next operation. But through it all, Jake kept his focus on what mattered most, keeping the team together, ensuring that they were always moving forward, not just as soldiers, but as a unit. It was during one of these training exercises that Jake felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders. It wasn't the pressure of the mission. It wasn't the weight of being the leader. It was something deeper, a responsibility to his men that he would never be able to shake. As the team prepared for their next deployment, Jake gathered them together for a quick briefing. "This next mission is going to be tough," he began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the situation. "But I have no doubt that we're ready. We've trained for this, and we've faced worse. We do this as a team, and we come home as a team. That's how it works." He looked around at each of them, seeing their determination. They weren't just following orders. They were with him. "Let's get this done. Together," Jake added. The team nodded, the sense of unity solidifying once again. In that moment, Jake felt a sense of peace. He wasn't in this alone. He had his team, and together, there was nothing they couldn't handle. As the team moved out for the operation, Jake stayed focused. The mission was still ahead of them, but for the first time, he wasn't just thinking about the objective. He was thinking about the people who were depending on him. And that, more than anything, gave him the strength to lead with confidence. The mission unfolded quickly, with the usual chaos of the field. But with every challenge that arose, Jake found himself acting not out of fear or doubt, but from the trust he had built with his team. They had faced adversity before, but now they were doing it together. The mission was successful, but it wasn't the victory that mattered most. What mattered was how they had handled it. They were more than just soldiers. They were a family, and that bond, forged through leadership and trust, would carry them through whatever came next. As Captain Jake Michaels stood at the edge of the base, watching the sunset, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had first stepped into the role of a leader, eager to prove himself, driven by ambition and a thirst for recognition. But now, after countless missions, challenges, and moments of introspection, Jake had come to realize something that changed everything. True leadership was never about accolades or titles. It was about the people you led, the trust you built with them, and the integrity with which you carried yourself. His journey had started with a desire to be the best soldier, the one who stood out. But it had transformed into a deeper understanding, a realization that leadership was about lifting others up, standing by them in the hardest times, and earning their trust day by day. The lessons he had learned from Sergeant Major Robert Carter had been pivotal in this transformation. Carter had been the embodiment of quiet strength and wisdom, a man who led not by force but by example. That was the type of leader Jake aspired to be, a leader who didn't need to shout orders or claim glory, but who instead earned respect through actions, through sacrifice, and through unwavering support for his team. As the helicopter engines roared in the distance, signaling the end of another successful mission, Jake felt the weight of the responsibility he carried. It wasn't just the responsibility of completing the mission or ensuring their survival. It was the responsibility of taking care of the people who depended on him. As the team gathered in the hangar, preparing to return to base, Jake stood back for a moment, observing them. They were more than just a group of soldiers. They were a unit, a family forged in the fire of adversity. And Jake was proud to be their leader. He had made mistakes along the way, but those mistakes had shaped him into the leader he was today. They had taught him the value of humility, the importance of listening, and the power of trust. As the team loaded their gear onto the transport, Lieutenant Jameson approached Jake once again. "Sir," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of respect and gratitude. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything. You've changed how I see leadership. It's not about being the loudest or the strongest. It's about being there for your team. I learned that from you." Jake felt a lump form in his throat at the sincerity in Jameson's words. It wasn't easy to hear praise. He had always been uncomfortable with it. But hearing it now, from a soldier he respected so much, meant more than any medal or commendation. "I didn't do it alone, Jameson," Jake replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is about all of us. We're in this together." Jameson gave a slight nod, his eyes reflecting a new understanding, a shared bond between them. As they boarded the transport and the engines hummed to life, Jake took one last look at the base. The challenges were far from over. There would always be new missions, new obstacles to face. But Jake knew now that he was ready for whatever came next. He wasn't the same man who had first set foot in that briefing room, eager to make a name for himself. He was a leader now, and the responsibility that came with that title was something he would carry with pride and humility. He had learned what it meant to lead with integrity, to earn the trust of his team, and to be there for them when it mattered most. As the transport took off, heading toward the next mission, Jake Michaels felt a quiet peace settle over him. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, he was confident in his ability to lead. He knew that with his team by his side, there was no challenge they couldn't face together. And that, more than anything, gave him the strength to move forward, knowing that the true measure of a leader wasn't in the missions they completed or the battles they won. It was in the people they led, the lives they touched, and the trust they built along the way.